May 2009. After 134 years, a Sheffield tool company shut its doors for the last time. Not because it had run out of money, but because its owners chose to close while they could still pay every creditor, every supplier, and every worker in full. A dignified death. What died that day? At its peak, Footprint forged the tools that built modern Britain. The wrench in the plumber's bag, the chisel that shaped the nation's bricks. 400 men once stood at its benches. By the end, barely a dozen remained. But here is the part nobody saw coming. A healthy, solvent company chose to die with honor. And then, against every rule of modern business, it clawed its way back from the grave. So why would a company choose death? And how exactly do the dead come back to life? Sheffield, England, 1875 to the present day. What happened here reveals the true price of survival. Long before there was a footprint, there was steel, and there was Sheffield. By the 18th century, the city in the valley of the River Don had become the iron heart of England. Its hills bristled with grinding wheels and forge smoke. Its name, stamped into a blade, was a promise of quality understood from London to the far edges of the empire. It was here, in the 1760s, that a firm called Alfred Ridge and Sons began turning out wood-boring tools, sturdy enough to be trusted by the Royal Navy, where a single failed drill could cost a ship and the men aboard her. This was the soil from which Footprint would one day grow, a trade built on a simple, unforgiving truth. A tool either worked or someone suffered for it. The name itself arrived in 1875. Thomas R. Ellin, born into a Sheffield family of cutlers, set up a tool business and chose for it a brand unlike any other in the trade. Footprint. The legend behind it is pure Sheffield. Ellin, so the story goes, drew his inspiration from Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe and the single footprint the castaway discovers in the sand. Proof, in a world of solitude, that one is not alone. A mark left behind, a trace that endures. For a maker of tools meant to outlast their owners, no symbol could have suited the work more perfectly. Footprint's first triumph was deceptively humble. In those early years, a Sheffield grinder devised a wrench to wrestle the heavy old grinding wheels off their spindles. A brute of a tool whose jaws bit harder the tighter the handle was squeezed. Plumbers and tradesmen took one look, understood it at once, and never let it go. By 1889, Ellin was registering and patenting his designs in earnest, the footprint wrench, and a family of adjustable spanners that would carry the brand into workshops across the world. The firm needed a home worthy of its ambitions, and in 1900 it found one. The new Footprint Works opened its gates in Hollis Croft, in the centre of Sheffield, a building that would shelter the company for the next 110 years. Within its walls, the rhythm of the trade settled in, the roar of the forge, the hiss of quenched steel, the steady chime of hammer on glowing metal. Day after day, a bar of carbon steel went in one end, and a finished tool, stamped with a footprint, came out the other. The world took notice. In 1906, Thomas R. Ellin carried his tools halfway across the planet and brought home proof of their worth, a gold medal for artisan tools at the New Zealand International Exhibition. A small Sheffield firm had been judged among the finest in the world. But a medal on a wall is not an empire. Footprint had a name, a symbol, and one brilliant wrench. What it did not yet have was scale. The men, the machinery, and above all the family that would turn a respected workshop into one of the largest toolmakers Britain had ever known. That family was about to walk through the door. The family was named Jewett, and they came not as conquerors, but as keepers. In 1932, John J. Jewett Sr. bought Alfred Ridge and Sons, the old Navy toolmaker whose roots reached back into the previous century. It was a quiet acquisition, the kind that makes no headlines, yet it set in motion something that would define 4 generations. A family bound, almost stubbornly, to the belief that Sheffield should go on making things with its hands. Then came the war. When Britain mobilized in 1939, its workshops mobilized with it, and Sheffield's toolmakers were handed a grimmer purpose. Thomas R. Ellin, the Footprint Works, became one of the principal suppliers of screwdrivers and pipe wrenches to the British and Commonwealth War Department, tools that found their way into tanks, aircraft, and the hands of the fitters, keeping the war machine running. But the most haunting contribution came from the Jewett's own Alfred Ridge. On the morning of June 6, 1944, as Allied soldiers waded onto the beaches of Normandy, some of the mine detectors sweeping the sand ahead of them had been made in Sheffield by Ridge. Tools firstborn to bore wood for the Navy were now feeling blindly for death, buried beneath a French shore. The firm survived the war that so many men did not, and in 1948, the Jewett family completed what it had begun 16 years earlier. It bought Thomas R. Ellin Footprint Works outright. For the first time, the famous brand and the family that would carry it into the 21st century stood beneath one roof. What followed was a golden age. Freed from the shortages of wartime, Footprint expanded with confidence, building a stable of brands that became familiar names in the trades. Footprint for the wrenches and builders' tools, alongside Domino, Climax, John Bull, and Clinker. A tradesman opening his bag in the 1950s might find half its contents stamped with a name the Jewetts owned. The little workshop that had won a medal in New Zealand was becoming something far larger. But the true measure of Footprint's rise was not the brands in its catalogue. It was the men on its floor, and the staggering numbers coming off it. By the 1950s, the Footprint Works in Hollis Croft had become a small empire of its own. The forges burned without pause, the air rang with the percussion of hammers, and the orders arrived faster than the men could fill them. At its height, the firm employed 400 grinders, forgers, handle turners, hardeners, each a master of a craft that took years to learn and a lifetime to perfect. And then, in 1958, came the moment that captured it all. That year, somewhere along the line, Footprint produced its 10 millionth pipe wrench. 10 million. From a single tool first dreamed up to strip a grinding wheel. The company had armed the plumbers and fitters of the world 10 million times over. Few firms of any kind could claim such a figure. Fewer still could claim it from one stubbornly British design that had barely changed in 80 years. Footprint was not merely making tools in great numbers. It was leading the world in how they were made. In 1966, the company achieved something no one on earth had done before. It became the first firm anywhere to forge cold chisels and bolsters in a single, full-length piece. A breakthrough that produced a stronger, truer tool than the welded and assembled versions its rivals turned out. A Sheffield family business was now setting the global standard for its craft. The crowning act came in 1968. That year, the Jewetts merged all their companies into one. Thomas R. Ellin, the chisel makers C.H. Jenkinson, the handle turners Charles W. Bacon, and the rest, under a single name and a single mark, Footprint Tools Limited. In one stroke, a scattering of old Sheffield workshops became one of the largest family-owned hand tool manufacturers in the United Kingdom. 400 workers, 10 million wrenches, a world-first forge, a name carried into homes and onto building sites the length of the country. This was the summit. From the soot and din of Hollis Croft, The Jewett family had built precisely what they had set out to build. A great Sheffield maker, run by its own owners, its tools trusted in every corner of the trade. And yet, even at the very top, the ground had begun to shift. Far away, in factories the Jewetts would never see, a different kind of tool was being made, cheaper, faster, and good enough. At first, it arrived on British shores as a trickle. Then it became a flood, and it took aim at everything Sheffield had spent 2 centuries building. The decline would not come as a single blow. It would come as a slow, patient strangulation, and it would last for decades. Greatness in business is rarely lost in a single afternoon. It is lost slowly, so slowly that those living through it can convince themselves year after year that next year will be better. For Footprint, the unravelling began not in Sheffield, but on the far side of the world. Through the post-war decades, a new kind of competition took shape in the workshops of Europe, and then of Asia. Tools could now be stamped out by machine, in their millions, by workers paid a fraction of a Sheffield wage. They were not always as good. Often, they were not good at all, but they were cheap. And to a builder counting every penny, or a hardware shop counting every margin, cheap had a logic all its own. A chisel forged by a Sheffield master might outlast its owner. A chisel pressed out in a foreign plant might last a season, but it cost a quarter of the price, and there were always more where it came from. Slowly, the flood rose, and the city that had taught the world to make tools began to watch the world stop buying its own. Sheffield felt it first in the trade that had made its name famous: cutlery. The knives and blades that had carried made in Sheffield into kitchens across the globe were undercut year upon year by cheaper imports, until much of the industry simply collapsed. Workshops that had run for a century went dark. Families who had ground and forged for generations found their skills suddenly worth nothing. The same tide that drowned the cutlers now lapped at the door of the tool makers, and Footprint stood directly in its path. The firm did not fall, but it began, quietly, to shrink. The great floor at Hollis Croft, once crowded with hundreds of men, grew a little emptier each year. Orders that had once been certain now had to be fought for. The Jewetts, by now into their 3rd generation, learned to run leaner, to cut what could be cut, to hold on. They rode out the brutal recession of the mid-1980s. They rode out the slump of the 1990s. Each time, the company emerged a little smaller, a little harder, still standing, and still, against all commercial sense, making its tools by hand in Sheffield. For a city built on making, this was more than an economic problem. It was a slow erasure of identity. Sheffield had defined itself for 200 years by what came out of its forges. Now those forges were closing, one after another, and with them went not just jobs, but a way of life. Footprint was becoming a survivor in a graveyard. But survival was buying time, not safety. And the deepest threat to the firm was not the price of a foreign chisel. It was something far closer to home, and far harder to fight. The threat was this: the craft itself was dying, not because the world had judged it worthless, but because almost no one was left who wanted to learn it. To forge a Footprint tool by hand was hard, hot, unforgiving work. It meant standing before a furnace year after year, learning to read the color of glowing steel by eye, to feel the exact moment a bar was ready under the hammer, to grind an edge true to a tolerance no machine could yet match. These were not skills written in any manual. They lived in the hands of the men who held them, earned over years of repetition that wore at the body and demanded a patience the modern world had less and less time for. As the old masters reached the end of their working lives, a quiet crisis took hold. fewer and fewer young people were willing to take up such hard, repetitive labor. To spend a decade becoming expert at a trade the wider economy seemed determined to leave behind. Why endure the heat of the forge when cleaner, easier, better paid work could be found elsewhere? Every craftsman who retired carried a piece of irreplaceable knowledge out of the door with him, and behind him stood no one to inherit it. A skill built over 2 centuries could be lost in a single generation. And so, Footprint found itself caught in a vice it could not escape. On one side, a market that wanted tools ever cheaper, cheaper than a hand-forged Sheffield tool could ever honestly be made. On the other, a workforce that was aging, thinning, and almost impossible to replace. To compete on price was to abandon the very quality that justified the name. To hold to the craft was to grow ever smaller in a world racing the other way. Around the firm, the last of its kind were falling. By the mid-2000s, Footprint had become one of the rare survivors of a vanishing trade. And in a telling sign of the times, it began gathering up the remains of those who had not made it. In 2006, the company bought the machinery, stock, and order book of Whitehouse, a long-established hammer maker in the Midlands. It was an act of survival dressed as expansion. The strong picking up the pieces of the fallen, an ever smaller circle of British makers keeping the old trades alive between them. For the Jewetts, now stewards of a business that had outlived almost all its rivals, the arithmetic was becoming impossible to ignore. The Hollis Croft works that had served the firm for over a century was aging. The machinery inside it was aging. The world wanted modern, efficient, high-volume production, and the old forge could no longer deliver it. Holding on year by year was no longer enough. If Footprint was to have a future at all, something would have to change. Boldly, expensively, and soon. So the family made a decision. They would stake everything on a single, sweeping act of renewal. A new factory, new machinery, a fresh start fit for the 21st century. It was a bet on survival, the largest the company had ever placed. The timing could not possibly have been worse. In 2008, after 108 years, Footprint prepared to leave Hollis Croft. It is hard to overstate what that meant. The works in the centre of Sheffield had been the company's home since 1900. Through 2 world wars, through the golden age of 400 men, through the long decline and every recession in between. Its walls were steeped in more than a century of smoke and sweat. To leave was to close a chapter that had outlasted nearly everyone who had ever worked there. But sentiment does not pay wages, and the old building could no longer carry the company forward. It was tired, expensive to run, and built for a world that no longer existed. The plan was bold, and on paper it was sound. Footprint would sell the Hollis Croft site and move across the city to Owlerton, to new premises christened the Admiral Works. There, in a modern factory, the company would do what survival now demanded: invest in new forging equipment capable of producing its tools faster, more efficiently, and at a cost that might finally stand against the foreign imports that had hollowed out the trade. It was an answer, at long last, to the vice that had been tightening around the firm for 30 years. A way to make the old craft pay in a new century. This was not retreat, it was reinvention. The Jewetts were not quietly winding down a dying business. They were betting the company's entire future on its renewal. Sell the old, buy the new, re-equip, and emerge leaner and stronger. A Sheffield maker fit to fight on for another 100 years. For a family that had refused, decade after decade, the easy road of cheap production overseas, it was the boldest expression yet of a single stubborn faith that there was still a future in making things properly, by hand and machine together, in Sheffield. And so, the company committed. The historic Hollis Croft Works was sold. The move to the Admiral Works began. Orders for new machinery were set in motion. It was an enormous undertaking, a relocation and a re-equipping at the same moment, the kind of upheaval that strains even a business in calm waters. But the Jewetts judged the prize worth the risk. After surviving so much for so long, they were reaching not merely to endure, but to win. Everything was staked on it. The sale of the old home would fund the new. The new equipment would justify the move. The whole carefully balanced plan rested on one quiet assumption, that the wider world would hold steady while Footprint made its leap. It did not. In the autumn of 2008, the global financial system seized. The collapse of major banks triggered the worst financial crisis in generations. Credit, the lifeblood of any company in the middle of an expensive transformation, simply dried up. Lending froze. Confidence evaporated. Across the world, businesses that had made careful, reasonable plans found the ground torn from beneath them overnight. And Footprint was caught at the very worst moment imaginable, mid-leap, suspended between an old home it had already sold and a new one not yet fully running, its survival riding on machinery it had not yet finished paying for. The managing director, Christopher Jewett, would later describe it with painful understatement. The recession and the credit crunch, he said, had struck just as the firm was moving from the city centre to Owlerton, exactly when it could least withstand a blow. The intention had been to settle into the new works, invest in the new equipment, and open up fresh markets. But, in his words, of course, the world changed. The change was merciless. The entire logic of the gamble had depended on financing the new forging equipment and then generating enough business to pay for it. Now the credit needed to complete the investment was gone, and the orders needed to service it were drying up as customers retreated into the same storm. A relocation by itself tests any company to its limits. A relocation colliding with a once-in-a-generation financial crisis was something else entirely. A trap with no clear way out. There was a bitter irony in it. The very boldness that should have secured Footprint's future was now the thing endangering it. Had the firm done nothing, stayed in the old works, made no investment, taken no risk, it might have limped on a while longer, smaller and safer. Instead, by daring to reach for renewal at precisely the wrong moment, it had exposed itself completely. The Jewetts had committed to the future just as the future was cancelled. Courage, this time, was being punished. At the heart of it all sat a single machine. The new forging press was the keystone of the whole plan. The one piece of equipment that would let Footprint produce at the scale and cost a modern market demanded. Without it, the new factory was just an expensive building. Without it, the entire bet fell apart. And without the funding the frozen markets would no longer provide, that machine was slipping beyond the family's reach. The Jewetts did not surrender easily. They explored every avenue that might keep the company alive: a merger, a sale, an outside buyer, any arrangement that would let Footprint go on. They turned the problem over from every angle, but each path led back to the same hard wall. Without the new forge, there was no viable business at all. No matter how the figures were arranged, the numbers told the same unforgiving truth. By the early months of 2009, the family that had carried Footprint for 60 years, through wars, through recessions, through the slow death of an entire industry, faced the one question they had spent their lives refusing to ask. Not how to grow, not how to survive, but how to end. There are two ways for a company to die. The first is the way most people imagine: the slow slide into insolvency, the unpaid bills, the creditors circling, the administrators called in. The doors are locked one morning without warning. The workers arrive to find they have no jobs and often no final wages. Suppliers go unpaid. The name, once proud, becomes a cautionary tale. It is death by collapse, undignified, involuntary, and cruel to everyone caught in its path. The second way is almost unheard of. It requires a company to look its own future in the eye, accept that the road ahead is impossible, and choose to stop, while it still has the means to do right by every single person it owes. In the spring of 2009, the Jewett family chose the second way. The mechanism had a dry, technical name, a members' voluntary liquidation. But behind the legal language lay something rare and quietly extraordinary. A members' voluntary liquidation can only take place if a company is still solvent, if its assets are enough to pay all of its debts in full. It is the very opposite of bankruptcy. It is, in effect, a company with enough left in hand to settle every account, choosing to wind itself down honorably rather than carry on until there is nothing left for anyone. This was the path Footprint took. After exhausting every other option, the directors made the hardest decision a family business can make. A 134-year-old company, which had ridden out 2 world wars and the recessions of the 1980s and 1990s, decided to call it a day. While it was still able to pay its staff, settle every debt in full, and complete the orders already on its books. At the head of that decision stood Christopher Jewett, the firm's managing director and a past master cutler of Sheffield, a man whose very title bound him to the city's centuries-old traditions. There was no hiding the pain of it. The company, he said, was desperately sorry it had come to this. But the alternative, to push on recklessly until the firm went bust, locking out its workers and leaving its creditors unpaid, was, to the Jewetts, unthinkable. In the financial wreckage of 2008 and 2009, countless businesses were failing, and most failed the first way, dragged under, leaving ruin behind them. Christopher Jewett knew his firm was far from alone. Not the first to fall in that crisis, and, as he openly admitted, not the last. But how a company fell, the family believed, still mattered. Footprint had been in the stewardship of the Jewetts since 1948. 3 generations of one family's name bound up in every tool that left the works. They would not let it end in disgrace. In May 2009, the announcement was made. After 134 years, Footprint Tools would close. Not crash, not collapse. Close. On its own terms, with its head held high. It was, in Christopher Jewett's own words, a dignified exit. A dignified exit, however, is still an exit. And for the men and women who made their living at the Admiral Works, the nobility of the decision could not soften its meaning. Their jobs were gone. Telling them was the cruelest part. These were not faceless names on a spreadsheet. In a firm like Footprint, many had given their working lives to the craft. Grinders and forgers who had spent decades at the same benches, whose skill was the company's truest inheritance. Now they were being told the works would close. Christopher Jewett did not pretend it was anything but a tragedy for them, and he expressed his deep regret that they would lose their livelihoods. But he held to one bleak consolation. Because the wind down was voluntary and orderly rather than a sudden collapse, his people were spared the final indignity. Unlike the workers of a company that crashes overnight, they would not be turned out without warning, nor left unpaid. They would leave with their wages settled and their dignity intact, as the company left with its own. And then there was the work itself, the last defining act of the whole sad business. A firm crashing into insolvency abandons its customers mid-order, leaving promises broken and jobs half-finished. Footprint refused to do that. Having chosen to wind down while still solvent, it set about completing the orders already on its books, finishing the job to the very end, exactly as it always had. Somewhere in those final weeks, the last pipe wrench of the old company was forged, ground, and stamped with the mark Thomas R. Ellin had chosen back in 1875, the single footprint in the sand, a trace left behind. The last tradesman to open a parcel from the original footprint tools would never have guessed that the firm which made it was, by then, already dying. The cruelty of the setting was almost too neat. The new factory the family had gambled everything on, bought to carry footprint into a second century, became instead the place where it was laid to rest. The forge that should have roared with renewal fell quieter and quieter. The benches emptied. The orders ran out. Tools that had been made in Sheffield by hand in an unbroken line stretching back to the days of sailing ships and the Royal Navy came to a stop. Consider what was ending. A name born in 1875, a symbol drawn from a story of survival, a firm that had armed plumbers and builders 10 million times over, that had helped clear mines from the beaches of Normandy, that had set the world standard for the forged chisel, that had refused for decade after decade to abandon Sheffield for cheaper shores. All of it, the brand, the craft, the unbroken thread of a family stewardship, appeared to be drawing to a close in a quiet factory in Owlerton, in the depths of the worst recession in living memory. There is a strange, bitter nobility in how Footprint chose to die. In an age when so many companies fight to the last gambling other people's money, leaving wreckage and unpaid wages in their wake, here was a family that did the opposite, that chose to lose cleanly rather than win dirty. They could have clung on, taken on debt they could never repay, and gone down in a way that ruined their creditors and locked out their staff. Instead, they chose the harder, quieter courage, to accept the end and to make certain that when it came, no one else would pay for it. It does not look like heroism. It makes no headlines. But for a family unwilling to betray a name it had carried for 60 years, it may have been the most honourable choice left on the table. By the summer of 2009, it was done. The staff had gone. The orders were complete. The debts were paid, every last one, exactly as the family had promised. The forge was cold. The benches were still. After 134 years, after 2 world wars, after a dozen recessions, after the slow strangling of an entire industry, Footprint Tools had come, at last, to its end. Silence is the loudest sound a factory can make. For more than a century, the footprint works had never truly been quiet. The forge roared, the hammers fell, the grinding wheels screamed against steel. Men called to one another over the din. Noise was the sound of survival. Proof, every working day, that Sheffield still made things. And then, in the summer of 2009, it stopped. Where there had been the controlled violence of the forge, there was now only the hum of an empty building and the slow settling of cooling metal. The Admiral Works, the gleaming new home meant to carry Footprint into its second century, stood half silent, a factory built for a future that had been cancelled before it ever arrived. The men were gone. Some had given 30 or 40 years to the trade. Their hands held the knowledge that could not be written down, only practiced. Now those hands were idle. A grinder who could read the temper of steel by the colour of a spark. A forger who knew the exact weight of a blow, found that the one place in the world with use for such a skill no longer existed. Across Sheffield, the story was wearily familiar. Another old maker had fallen. Another set of doors had closed. Another fragment of the city's 200-year identity had been quietly subtracted from the map. This was the true cost of the collapse, and it was not counted only in pounds. It was counted in knowledge lost. Every craftsman who walked out of the Admiral Works for the last time carried away an irreplaceable inheritance, techniques refined over a lifetime, the muscle memory of a trade learned the hard way. When such a man retires with an apprentice at his side, the knowledge survives. When he leaves through a closing factory gate with no one to pass it to, the chain breaks. And a broken chain is far harder to mend than to keep. For the wider trade, Footprint's fall felt almost like a verdict. Here, after all, was no reckless firm that had brought ruin upon itself. Here was one of the good ones, a company that had done nearly everything right. It had kept faith with quality when rivals chased cheapness. It had stayed in Sheffield when others fled abroad. It had made by hand what could have been stamped out by machine. It had, in the end, even chosen to die honourably, rather than drag others down with it. If a company like Footprint could not survive, what hope was there for British hand tool making at all? The closure seemed to confirm the bleakest reading of the age, that there was simply no longer a place, in a world of cheap imports and thin margins, for the slow and stubborn art of making things properly. For the Jewetts, the blow cut deeper than any balance sheet. For 3 generations, the family's identity had been inseparable from the firm. Its name was their name, its reputation, their reputation, its daily life, the rhythm of their own. To preside over its end was not merely to lose a business. It was to watch a part of themselves close down with the gate. Few who have not built something with their own family's hands can fully understand what that costs. And the name itself. That, perhaps, was the strangest part of all. For a brand does not vanish the way a factory falls silent. Out in the world, hundreds of thousands of Footprint tools went on doing their work as though nothing had happened. In a plumber's bag in Bristol, a pipe wrench gripped a stubborn fitting. On a building site in Birmingham, a brick bolster bit clean through stone. In a shed in Australia, in a workshop in New Zealand, the single footprint stamped into worn steel kept its silent promise of quality. Made by men who no longer had a company to belong to. The tools outlived the firm. The footprint endured, even as the feet that made it had walked away. This was the bottom of the story. A 134-year-old company, founded in the age of Victoria, was gone. Its workers were scattered. Its forge was cold. Its great gamble had failed. By every ordinary measure of business and history, the tale of Footprint tools was finished. A poignant footnote in the long, sad ledger of British industrial decline. The kind of story that ends with a demolished building and a faded photograph. But there was one small thing the closure had not destroyed. One ember, easy to miss, glowing faintly in the ashes. When the company wound down, the Jewett family did not let everything go. They could have walked away entirely, washed their hands of a business that had cost them so dearly. They did not. Quietly, almost instinctively, they held on to the one thing no liquidation could measure on a balance sheet: the name, the brand, the footprint in the sand, and everything it stood for. At the time, it can have looked like little more than sentiment. A grieving family unwilling to surrender the last trace of something it had loved. No one watching could have guessed what that small act of refusal would make possible. Because a name, unlike a factory, can sleep, and what sleeps can wake. The forge was cold, but the footprint was still there, and somewhere out in the world, people had begun to notice that it was missing. The first sign came not from a boardroom, but from the people who used the tools. When word spread that Footprint tools had entered liquidation, something unexpected happened. From across Britain and from as far away as the United States and Australia came a wave not of indifference, but of genuine grief. Tradesmen, retailers, and lifelong users sought out the news and made their feelings plain. They were sorry, truly sorry that the company was gone. For a maker of unglamorous hand tools, it was a remarkable response. People do not usually mourn a wrench. But these were not ordinary tools, and theirs was no ordinary maker. There is a particular bond between a tradesman and a tool he trusts. A good wrench, a good chisel, becomes an extension of the hand that holds it. Bought once, used for decades, often handed down. A worker who has reached for the same footprint wrench for 20 years does not see a commodity. He sees a companion that has never let him down. When the maker of that companion vanishes, it feels less like a shop closing and more like losing something personal. That was the loyalty now making itself heard in letters and messages from workshops half a world away. That outpouring told the Jewett family something no spreadsheet ever could. The numbers had said the business was finished. The people were saying the opposite, that the world did not want footprint to disappear. There was still demand. There was still loyalty. There was still, against every commercial signal of the crisis, a place for these tools, and the family had, almost without daring to hope, kept the one thing that could answer that demand, the name itself. So the Jewetts made a second decision, one that, in its quiet way, took as much courage as the first. Having buried the company with dignity, they resolved to bring it back. They secured the footprint brand and its intellectual property, the designs, the patterns, the mark in the sand, and set about the near impossible task of resurrecting a firm that had, only months before, ceased to exist. The support of their customers, they said, had given them the confidence to try. It is worth pausing on how rare this is. Companies die every day, and they stay dead. A liquidation is meant to be final, the orderly disassembly of something that has failed. To take a name that has been formally wound down and breathe working life back into it is simply not how these stories usually go. The ordinary ending had already been written in May. What the Jewetts attempted that autumn was to write a second one. What rose from the ashes was not the old empire. It could not be. There would be no 400 workers, no vast floor of forges, no roar to match the golden age. The new venture was a fraction of what had fallen, modest, careful, almost fragile, but it was alive. On the 1st of October 2009, barely months after the forge had gone cold, a company called Footprint Sheffield Limited began trading. The name was new, the bloodline was not. It was the former holding company of Footprint Tools, the same family, the same city, the same stubborn refusal to let the craft die. And it began exactly where any wise rebirth begins, at the very heart of what had made the brand worth saving in the first place. There was no attempt to relaunch the whole sprawling catalogue at once. Instead, the company started with a handful of its most iconic products, the tools that were Footprint in its purest form. Chief among them was the wrench that had started everything, the original 698 pipe wrench and its thumb-turn cousin, the very design first dreamed up by a Sheffield grinder back in 1875. Alongside it came the builder's line pin, a humble essential of the trade. It was a deliberate, almost poetic choice. The company that had begun life on the strength of a single brilliant wrench was being reborn on the strength of that same wrench, more than 130 years later. The footprint had not changed. It did not need to. This was no triumphant return. It was a first tentative breath. A small workshop producing a short list of products, feeling its way back into a market that had nearly written it off. The plan, the family explained, was to bring more lines back gradually, in the new year and beyond, but always within limits, always carefully. After the catastrophe of overreach, there would be no more reckless leaps. This time, Footprint would grow only as fast as it could safely stand. Rebuilding from almost nothing is its own kind of ordeal. Relationships with suppliers had to be remade, customers reassured, a reputation that had been declared dead quietly proven alive again, and all without the cushion of scale that had once absorbed the firm's mistakes. Now every order mattered. Every tool had to earn the brand's name afresh. But the essential, astonishing fact remained. A company that had closed its doors after 134 years, that had been laid to rest, mourned, and consigned to the ledger of British industrial decline, was making tools in Sheffield again. The ember the family had refused to let die had caught. The footprint, asleep, had woken. The grave, it turned out, was not the end of the story. It was only the lowest point of it, and the climb back, slow, hard, and far from over, was just beginning. Resurrection in the films is instant, a flash of light, and the hero stands again. Real life is slower and far less glamorous. The years after 2009 were not a victory lap. They were a long, patient climb. One product added at a time, one customer won back, one careful step after another. There were no headlines, no triumphant march back to the glory days. There was only work, the daily, unspectacular labor of proving again and again that a Sheffield hand tool was still worth making and still worth buying. Slowly, the range grew. Slowly, the orders returned. And slowly, against the odds, Footprint became not a memory, but a going concern once more. Today, well over a decade on, the company is still there. Still in Sheffield, still making tools. It remains in the hands of the Jewett family, now into its fourth generation, with Christopher Jewett continuing to lead the business his family has stewarded since 1948. The 698 pipe wrench still rolls off the line, forged to the very same design as Sheffield grinder sketched out in 1875. The footprint is still stamped into the steel. The promise it carries is unchanged. But honesty matters more than sentiment, and the honest picture is a humble one. This is survival, not restoration. Where 400 workers once filled the floor, today the company employs only around a dozen people. The empire did not come back. What came back was something smaller, tougher, and in its way more remarkable. A craft that simply refused to be extinguished, kept alive by a handful of hands in a single Sheffield workshop. How does such a firm survive at all when the giants around it fell? The answer lies in one stubborn choice. Footprint did not try to beat the cheap imports at their own game. That war was lost long ago. Instead, it went the other way entirely, staking everything on quality, on heritage, on the simple value of a tool genuinely made in Sheffield by people who know how. In a market drowning in the disposable, Footprint chose to be the opposite. Premium, durable, proudly British. It is a narrow path, but it is one that cheap mass production cannot follow. And here lies the most surprising turn of all. The very thing the company died reaching for, modern forging, the machinery that would let the old craft compete in a new century. It has, at last, begun to grasp. In May 2023, Footprint installed a precision linear forge worth £1.4 million, the only machine of its kind in the United Kingdom, developed with partners including the Henry Royce Institute and the Advanced Forming Research Centre. Its purpose is to forge more cleanly and efficiently than ever before. The future of the craft, finally arriving in the workshop of one of its oldest practitioners. The dream the 2008 gamble was chasing did not die in the liquidation. It simply had to be earned the long, hard way. Footprint has embraced the new in other ways too. Working with Sheffield's Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, The company brought a robot onto its line to help produce its builder's line pins, a machine taught, in effect, to mimic the patient hand movements of the craftsman who once did that work. It is a strange and fitting image, the ancient skill that nearly died with its makers, now partly preserved in steel and code so that it might carry on, old and new, hand and machine, working the same bench. So what, in the end, is the meaning of footprint tools? It is not a simple story of triumph, and it would be false to pretend otherwise. A great firm shrank to a fraction of itself. Hundreds of livelihoods were lost. A craft that once helped employ a city now survives in a single room. That is the real cost of 2 centuries of change, and no comforting ending erases it. But neither is it a story of defeat. The deepest lesson of footprint is this: there is more than one way to measure survival. The company could have died the ordinary way, bust, disgraced, dragging others down. It chose to die with honor, and in doing so kept something worth coming back for. It could have stayed dead, as nearly every liquidated firm does. It chose instead to wake. And it could have surrendered its craft to the cheapest bidder decades ago. It chose, year after year, to keep making things properly in Sheffield, by hand, even when that choice made no commercial sense at all. The footprint Thomas R. Ellin chose in 1875 was the mark Crusoe found in the sand, proof that something had passed this way, a trace that endures long after the maker has gone. It could hardly be more fitting. Empires fall and forges cool, but some things leave a mark too deep to erase. A tool in a tradesman's hand, a name that would not die. A small Sheffield workshop, still glowing, still hammering, still here, long after the world had counted it out. That is the true price and the true reward of survival. Look at the tools in your own hands and ask how many were built to last and how many were built to be thrown away. If you believe stories like footprints deserve to be remembered, like this video and subscribe, so we can keep bringing the forgotten histories of the world's great factories back to life. And tell us below, which vanished or surviving maker should we uncover next?